Hello and welcome. I hope you've been enjoying your time so far at the 3rd annual Netreo User Conference. My name is Zack Weingartner. I am a professional service engineer here at Netreo for the past 4 years. For my session today, I am going to be discussing how you can leverage Netreo's APIs in your deployment. We'll be covering some use cases and how you can interact with these APIs. I'll be doing this through Postman for today's demonstration. The APIs that I'll be discussing today, overall, the kind of objective here is to leverage these APIs to help streamline some of your administrative efforts, automate some of the processes so that you can lessen the time spent, right? And this really is going to be like full life cycle of the device and monitoring, from the addition of the device all the way through being able to extract certain data from that device so that you can either keep longer historical logs of this, or perhaps you have other platforms that utilize some of this gathered data to provide reporting or dashboarding for end users or some kind of nature like that. So in reality, using these APIs should give you the ability of using some type of source of truth, kind of starting from the beginning here through the addition process. If we have, a list, even just a flat file or CMDB, perhaps, of the devices that are in your environment that you would like to have monitored, we would then be able to utilize our new device API to interact with that database of devices and add those devices into Netreo. And this is pretty extensive as well. I mean, you can get pretty granular in the properties that you're setting for these devices. You can even utilize this endpoint to build net new things within inside of the Netreo platform based off of certain conditions that are required from that source of truth, right? So you can really drive a lot of the organization of those devices and the monitoring of those devices with the use of this API, which in itself eliminates a lot of that administrative overhead of simply just having to go into Netreo and add it. Now, of course, there is other addition methods that you can use that are automated, but this one does give a certain level of control when utilizing this API endpoint, especially if we have some sort of source of truth to work with. Now, with that, there are some other APIs that you can utilize in tandem with the new device API, just to make sure you're kind of getting a full picture of everything that's happening, keeping in mind that all of this is removed from actually having to interact with the Netreo UI. Now, of course, you can always go into the UI and do certain things, but if you're kind of wanting to take a hands-off approach and really building automation, you have that ability with these APIs. Some other APIs that you can utilize in kind of building this strategy are going to be like your device info API. So we have some condition that we've built for device onboarding. This is going to be, some flat file that we have or a database. Of course, there'll be some work in between where we're going to have to build out, perhaps a script or something that sits in the middle that utilizes this API. But we can then use that, and then based off of what we're expecting to see on that device once it's onboarded, we can then utilize another API to validate that, this device does belong in the groupings that we expect it to. It has the right property set, it's got the right device name, IP on, and so forth. Again, keeping us removed from actually having to go in and interact with the UI, eliminating a couple of those steps when having to administer. You can also then even remove devices through, interacting with one of the APIs. So perhaps we've got a condition where if something's matched in the CMDB, it kicks off, some type of execution where it then uses the delete API so that it removes those devices. So keeping that cycle clean, as devices are being introduced, as long as it's meeting whatever we set for the condition, it's firing those off, it's building out the new devices, it's setting the properties, even building out new categories and strategic groups and sites, if that's the case. We can validate all of that through another API call, and then we could utilize a remove or a delete API to then remove any of those devices that may be being decommissioned, thus keeping the system clean so we don't have stuff stagnant in there or constantly causing alarm or automatically getting disabled because it's been in a down state for so long. And now that's just one half of the equation for that kind of full life cycle that I was mentioning. So after we get the devices onboarded, added, validated, and such, and they've been into the system for some time, we may have some requirements removed from the abilities of Netreo. Now, keep in mind that Netreo itself has an ability of sending reports and dashboards and a number of awesome things that you can do with inside of the platform. But kind of keeping on that same train of thought of being removed and trying to automate a lot of these things, perhaps in your environment, you have some type of service you provide to end users, and that service allows them to see some type of dashboard or generate some type of reporting or something like that. Now, perhaps we don't want them to come straight into Netreo, or perhaps we don't even want Netreo to be sending those reports. We have some type of intermediate in between the two. We can then utilize another set of APIs offered through Netreo to then extract the data that we've been collecting after device addition and place that where we so choose, whether that's just pulling the raw data out so that we can ingest it at the time of execution, or whether we're taking that and storing it in some type of data lake, or some other database that's then going to be utilized for those systems to pull from, or perhaps dependent on volume and frequency, we have those systems talk directly to Netreo to pull that performance information out. So there are a couple of APIs that we'll demonstrate today that can really tie that whole life cycle off, right? So from the time of addition, getting the devices in there, checking on them, validating them, removing them if necessary, all the way through after they've been in there and they've collected all of the data, you've already validated them, then being able to pull out that information and kind of manipulate it as you see fit. Now, the APIs that you will be talking about today to accomplish that will be APIs more directed for large sets of data. So we can do things where we pull out multiple devices and all of the performance metrics for those devices. We can do the same thing for like uptime and host status, as well as service checks. So you really can get and interact with the Netreo APIs in such a way where you can start from the infancy of addition all the way through the maturity of it being monitored and extracting that data out and doing with it as you see fit. As mentioned, another reporting application or platform or something like that, or just pulling the data out itself. So as mentioned, I do want to demonstrate interacting with some of these APIs just to kind of give you an idea of what to expect. I'll also be posting some links to the documentation that cover some of the things that you're going to see through the demonstration. I won't have enough time today to walk through every single one of the things. As mentioned before, they are pretty extensive, but I will spend some time going through some of the areas that are important, of course, the things that are required to get these things to work, and what to expect in some of the responses. Give me a second and let me pull up my application. So as mentioned, I will be working through Postman today to demonstrate how to interact with some of these APIs. Now I've done some legwork ahead of time and built these calls out. Postman, it's a great utility. We won't get into how to configure it and administrate it, but depending on what you're doing is kind of maybe an in between a testing layer. It is great. You can do a lot of things. You can build variables out. So there is a lot of capability there. One of the reasons why I chose to use it for my demonstration purposes today. So again, starting at kind of the beginning of the life cycle here, we've got, devices that we want to get onboarded into Netreo. So the API that we will be utilizing to do that is going to be the new device API. So the very first thing, and again, I will post the links so that you guys have all of this information at will, and you can come see all of this. Don't feel like you have to take all of these notes right away. But the very first thing is we're going to have to specify the endpoint that we're going to be calling. In this particular effort, this is going to be the new device API.php endpoint. And essentially, that's going to be appended to your instance's URL. So this can be the IP or the FQDN, just depends on how you have it set up in your environment. Now, in this particular case, it is set as a variable inside of Postman, so I already have it configured somewhere else. All right, now getting into the body. So the first thing is we are going to have to specify all of the parameters of the call, including if we have authentication set with inside of the body. So if you are working in Postman, I would suggest you come over to body and set that up. You can just use your the form URL encoded option here to build those key pair values. Now, as mentioned, you're going to see here, there's going to be a lot of different parameters that we can send across inside of that body. One thing to notate here is the ones that have the check marks highlighted, those are the ones that are required. So real quick, in this new device API, in reality, the only things that we need are the passwords. This is going to be the API key, and this is only if we have it configured in our system to require that. A valid IP for that device. Again, this is going to have to be something, or we prefer it to be reachable, but you can't force it in there. Just know that it will go into a host down. And at the very bottom, we have these two options. And of course, you can move these parameters up in your call if you so chose. But down here, we also have two options called pull and enabled. So pull, basically what this option is saying is that when this device comes into the system, we're expecting it to respond to one of the credential sets that we either have in the system or that we're specifying on this device. And we want it to pull in that performance metrics, if applicable. The other option, enabled, what this actually is doing is this is enabling or disabling the device outright. So maybe you're wanting to add in the device and just have it in a disabled state. Perhaps we're going to have them turned on at a later point. We're just staging. So you can set that to 0, and then the device is going to outright be disabled, not consume a license and those type of things. Now, as mentioned, these two are required. Defaultly, have them set to 1 because that's going to onboard the device. But if you are requiring it to be in a disabled state or perhaps in just like a host monitoring state, you can change these. 0 would be the opposite there. All right, now going through some of the other options you can set. Now, again, as I'd mentioned, these are the only things that are required. So as a matter of fact, if I came over here, and I pulled up the response section and I fired this guy off, as you can see, the device has been successfully added. We can then use our device info and get some information, make sure it's been added. But again, just showing that that is really all we need is the IP. So you can, add in a bunch of devices. Also take this as a note of cautionary as well, that there is just a small set of parameters that are required to onboard a device. So if mistakenly we're having some type of script built utilizing this and, it's not taking that into consideration, there could be potential for a lot of devices added without all of the other properties set. Now, getting into some of the awesomeness of this API, in my opinion, is you have the ability of doing almost about everything that you would expect to see on that monitored device with inside of this API. So again, really kind of taking that focus of streamlining the administration, of onboarding, of the creation of groups, of all of those things can all really be handled through this API call. So the very first thing that you can set up in here is the device name. So if you're wanting your device to have a name, once it's added into the system, you simply just set that there. There are some things to be aware of, like special characters, underscores, and dashes. Again, this will be notated inside of the documentation when you go and review that. You can also set your SNMP pub. So there's going to be your string so that we're able to, if it's not already inside of the system, we can specify it here. So the idea here, though, is that, maybe we've already taken some time, we've built out the templates, we put our credentials in there. Again, though, if we haven't, we can always specify it on the device. You can set things like the device type, subtypes. There are things that we have that are called user profiles that are partitions, so that if you're wanting to build it to where it's only a certain set of users can view those devices and those devices alone, you can actually build that out with inside of that API. Now that's a huge administrative task in its own, where you're building that out, maybe going through the UI. It is something that you can build out if you have an extensive configuration of this that's required. You would be able to handle that through the API rather than having somebody go through a number of clicks when building it out inside of the UI. Rediscovery is only going to be pertinent for devices that are already onboarded into the system, but we have things like auto configuration rules. Perhaps we want a device to go back through that set of auto configuration rules to ensure that based off of our structure, they're still existing there. You can make that happen with inside of this API call. And then you can get into some more of the common factors, like maybe setting a category, or a strategic group, or maybe you want multiple strategic groups for this device to live in. You can have that all set with inside of the API. You can set a site just top level, or you can get very granular with all of the different information that you're providing to that site. Keep in mind that Netreo has the ability of building out geocoded sites so that you have a map that you can look at and see pins that are plotted to where those devices exist. So you can, easily set the latitude and longitude if you're wanting it to be specified with inside of your call. This is something that is automatic in the system, but you do have the ability of setting it with inside of the API. Some other awesome uniqueness within the new device API is we have the option of adding what are called device attributes to our devices that we're monitoring. This is going to be like additional documentation for the device, if you will. So perhaps we've got, a number of different things that we need to set as far as a documentation property on the device so that maybe we can do things like run auto configuration rules against them. One thing that we can do is based off of that information, we can have all of that streamlined in through this API. This is something, so I have it set here just one time to set like a location. So now I can go to that device, I can go to the documentation, I can see the location of this device is going to be underneath the house. You can also duplicate this, so you can have this same pair name value attribute as many times as you want. So perhaps you're needing to build out a large set of documentation attributes with a device for just informational purposes when somebody's troubleshooting it. You can do that with inside of this API. You can also add in contact information. So perhaps when a device goes down, there's an administrator that needs to be contacted. If you have a CMDB or some type of database that has all of this information in it, it's simply just then taking that and tying it into these different endpoints and then building that out with inside of Netreo so that if somebody's troubleshooting that device, they have all of that information at hand. And then one other awesome ability here is there is an option to filter interfaces. So, perhaps we've got, a switch that we're going to add into the system. And perhaps that switch has a description on it for all of the access layer ports. And of course, we don't want to add those in because they can go up and down continuously. With this API, we can then add an advanced interface filter. And one thing to keep in mind is this is an inclusion filter. So anything we put here is what's going to be added as an interface. Anything that's not matched when we look that up for its description is not going to be added. So we can drive things inside of here so that we're excluding those interfaces that we don't care about, having added into the system because we don't need to monitor them at all because we understand that, they're going to be going up and down. And then again, tying it off, the two required options down at the bottom are the pull and enabled. So once you have your call built out with all of the information that you would like, you simply can execute. And what you should expect to see as long as you've got everything set up correctly is going to be a success message. Now, depending on what's going on, you're going to see some things like it being added to a group, if it's being updated and that type of stuff, any filters that may be in place. Now, a couple of things, there are some things to keep in mind, right? Some different outputs that you can get. So like, for instance, if we don't have a valid IP and we fire that off, of course, you're going to get back a different response there. Ooh, actually, that should not have happened. Yep, there you go. So you'll get a failure device addition there. If we're missing a parameter, like perhaps, we don't have this and we have authentication enabled, it's going to come back and tell you, hey, we need to have an authenticated user that we can use. Or even if you have one of these parameters wrong, right? Maybe we've got this at password instead of PWD and we fire that off. Again, you're going to get a response. Now, that one isn't quite as elaborate in telling you what the issue is, but as you can see, we're still going to get that addition failed. So if you are running into some of these things, I guess the common topic here is to take away is that review that documentation, make sure that you have these in place. It is very important. If there are certain things that are not in place here, you are going to run into problems where you're having device addition failures. But as long as you've got the things in place that are required, that device should come into the system. Now, once we've added that device, perhaps we're wanting to get some information back on that device so we can understand if some of the attributes that we've set with inside of our call, some of the properties we've set rather inside of our call are actually going to be on that device. Again, we can always go to Netreo's UI and we can go look at that device. Or if we're wanting to stay with the APIs, we do have a device info API. So basically, we can call this API, and it's a very simple one. We just need the password if authentication is enabled, and the IP of the expected device, and then a method, which is going to be get info is the only method we have at this time, just to get the information back from that device. You fire that across, and then you're going to have a result come back, and it's going to give you some information. Now, one thing to notate here is a lot of this information is going to kind of be coded, if you will. So like a category is going to come with inside of an index and not actually the category name. There are some other APIs that I won't discuss today, but you can find in the documentation linked that you can then use to correlate what that identification number is to the name of that category. You can also utilize your UI to kind of get that information as well, but know that that is information that you can get from another API to tie that stuff together. And then last but not least, in regards to kind of that addition process, validation and deletion is the delete device API. Again, a pretty straightforward API call, password if we have authentication enabled, and then just the name of the server. This can also be the IP, I believe, of that server. And then all you simply do is execute, and it'll come back and let you know that it's completed. Now, if you try to execute on a device name that is not present, it's going to come back and it's going to tell you, hey, that device doesn't exist. All right. I guess now let's move on over. So that kind of is getting the device into the system, validating the device and kind of its assignments, removing a device if required. Now, once the device is in there, it's been in there for some time, and we're wanting to pull back some information on that device, at least an hour, because that is the smallest time frame we can get. We can then utilize a couple other API endpoints to gather some of that information, whether that's to ship it off to another platform, put it into cold storage, whatever the case may be. Those API endpoints, and there's a few of them to keep in mind, right? There's other performance API endpoints that you can see in the documentation. But for the purpose of today's demonstration, I went ahead and elected for the bigger API return, right? So the other one we have is going to be on a single device basis. The one cool thing here, and this is going to be for time series to start with, is it's going to be able to return us our time series data for our devices across the group, so multiple devices. So if we are in a condition where we're needing to pull back a lot of information, right? Maybe we need to get performance information for all of the devices in a particular grouping rather than just a singular device. This API endpoint will give you that ability. So going through, again, kind of the same as with the other one, I have highlighted the required fields with a check mark. Anything that's not check marked is not a required field. This can all be found inside of the documentation again. So first off, API. Second is going to be your metric filter stat group. So this is going to be what group we're expecting to get the information returned on. So we don't have the ability of saying like in a single call, I want like CPU, memory, disk, and all of it back in one time, but you do have the ability of calling particular groups. So we would have to make multiple calls, but you can get it all back for all of the devices in a particular group. The next is going to be your filter unit. So whatever unit, this is going to obviously be based off of your stat group. Filter by, so some options you have here are going to be the different groupings that you're going to find your devices inside of Netreo. So i.e. category, site, strategic group, or the device itself, if you are so choosing to target a device. And then whatever that group is going to be, right? So if we're looking at category, we simply just have to go look at our categories within the side of our Netreo system and copy that name over into our API call to get the devices from that category to populate. There are other API calls that you can make. So if you're wanting to try to keep yourself from going into the UI at any point, you can utilize other API calls to get a list of all of the different groupings that Netreo has built out in it at any given time. The next option is going to be your filter by. So there's two that you can select from here. You can either do a time offset. So that's going to be what you would see inside of the UI when looking at like a report or a histogram. There are going to be a set of options that you can utilize, which we'll get into here in a second, and then a specific time. So if you utilize a specific time, when building out this call, one thing to keep in mind is it's going to be an epoch timestamp. So whatever time frame that you're wanting, you'll have to get the epoch start and end time to be able to get all of the data returned for that time period. Other than that, if you are using that filter value, you do have a number of preset time periods that we can elect from. So starting with last hour, going all the way up to last month. Now, as you get into some of the larger calls, keep in mind how large of a data set you're going to be calling versus how long to expect that data to come back, how long it's going to take for that data to come back. And if we're calling extremely large data sets across extremely large time frames, we're likely not going to get that return just because we don't have enough resources to answer that call. So just keep in mind as you're kind of looking at these time frames and you're driving some of those data calls, the volume of data that you're expecting to get back there. After we go through our timings, we then have our ability of our format filtering. So we can either set this up as like an average. We can see just the peaks of the data that we're calling, or we can have this an aggregate of both of those. So select whatever that is that you're trying to achieve based off of this call. Then we're going to have our format filter value. So this is going to be based on whether or not we're selecting aggregate here, right? So if we're aggregating all of the data, average and peak, the next thing it's going to want to know is, are we wanting to aggregate that data over what time filter value? Hourly, daily, monthly, what aggregate are we looking at there? And then you also have the option, if chosen aggregate, whether or not you want all of the information back, or if you're just wanting to see like the minimums of those values, the maximums or the averages of those values. Again, being that it's an aggregate, you'll have the option of choosing that. And then the last options you have here to choose from are your record counts. So if you are calling large sets of data, you can limit, so you can kind of help the resource load there by setting up pagination. So you're only having so many records returned per call, right? All right, once you have all of the parameters that you have elected, you can go ahead and fire the call off. And then you'll get back the information based off of that call. So again, all of this information is going to be included in the body of your calls, including that authentication. But you can then take this information, you can take this in a, whatever output that you want and dump that into, a data stream or a cold storage or perhaps another platform that could utilize this information. And then in the same sense, we also have the ability of doing the same thing, but for the device status is. So we were just looking at performance metrics. So, those things that we're pulling on a 5-minute interval, CPU, memory, disk. We also have the ability of taking a look at some of the availability information we get back, right? So any of the services that we find on a device, if we go look at a device inside of Netreo, this is going to be anything that's found on that service tab. These are going to be the things that are kind of, the status of certain things, interfaces, host status, that type of idea. So really tying off kind of the whole extracting the data from Netreo and the API form to then utilize to build reporting or dashboards or help augment another platform. So again, there are some requirements here. Password, if you've got authentication enabled, you'll have to set up your filter by. So this is going to be the same thing. What are we going to be looking at? A category, a site, a strategic group, or a device. You're going to name based off of the naming of the group that you're trying to get the information back on. And then your service filter is going to be what it is we're trying to get the information back on. So if we're wanting just to understand the host status, we can set host only here. And that's going to tell us what the host status has been over for those devices. And then we can also set the service description if we're wanting to get like a particular description of or the status of a particular service based off of its description. So as an example, in this particular case, there is a device that has some interface checks. So if I put interface, I don't have to specify the interface. Now I can if I'd want to limit it to that. But if I'm just wanting to get the checks back for interfaces, I simply can send that across. And now I can see that information, the device name, when it was updated, if it's up, if it's down. So being able to take some of that information that Netreo's collecting and pull it out from the API, not relying on the reporting abilities or dashboarding abilities of Netreo, and being able to take that off to really manipulate and use as you see fit. All right, and that concludes today's session. I hope through my demonstration, you have learned a little bit in how to utilize and leverage Netreo's APIs to eliminate some of that administrative overhead and build out some automation. Thank you so much for joining, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your 2022 Netreo User Conference.
Running.